Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are coming to us from today. We have viewers from over 20 different countries registered today to hear about a topic that is front of mind for the trade community and the world at large, what we might expect to see in a second Trump or Biden administration. While our speakers maybe won't tackle all the weighty questions that topic raises, we will try to peek around the corner at what might come on trade, which I think maybe we got a little preview of with the announcement this morning that many of us may have read in the Washington Post that David Lynch put up at 5 a.m. this morning. Before we get to today's event, we have two important China-related events coming up in the next few weeks. A week from today, we'll be hosting a joint webinar with the Asia Society Policy Institute to discuss the recent trade case brought against China for their shipbuilding and logistics practices. It's a thing that's partly in the news today about the tariffs and the 301 investigation. And next month, we're going to hold a two-day seminar to provide some background and context for what's happening with the overall U.S.-China relationship with some amazing speakers, including a couple of the people who are here with us today. Information on both those events, as well as what the WITA Academy is doing this spring, can be found on our website, www.wita.org, and our team just popped into the chat. As you know, if you've joined us online before, we like to call out the names of some of those you are in community with at today's event, even if you can't see them online. Welcome today to Christopher Collins, a director with the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, Astrid Ruggieri, a senior manager with the BMW Group, Cordell Hull, head of trade and economic security policy at Amazon Web Services, and Nelson Cunningham, who is between opportunities. Welcome, Christopher, Astrid, Cordell, and Nelson, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching on Zoom, you should have received a copy of our event program by email a little while ago, and links to our speaker biographies so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. You can also ask questions of our distinguished panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can today. I couldn't be more pleased than to welcome our terrific panel here today, and I'm incredibly grateful to each of them for making time to join us. Peter Harrell, a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former senior director for international economics and competitiveness at the National Security Council at the White House for President Biden. Greta Peisch, a partner at Wiley Rein and former general counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative for President Biden, among other things. Kellyanne Shaw, a partner at Hogan, Lovells, and lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, former deputy assistant to the president for international economics and deputy national economic council director at the White House for President Trump. And Stephen Vaughn, a partner at King & Spalding and the former general counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative for President Trump as well. And our moderator, who needs no introduction if you keep up with the biggest stories of the day on international trade, David Lynch, the global economics correspondent at the Washington Post. Thank you, David, Peter, Kellyanne, Greta, and Stephen for joining us. David?
Well, good morning, Ken. Good morning, panelists, and good morning to everybody taking time to watch us today. We've got a great lineup and a lot to talk about, so we'll get right to it. I want to start with the news of the day. As most of you probably know, President Biden had new protections for the steel industry today. He's calling for more than tripling the current tariff on Chinese steel and aluminum products coming into the country. And so, Steve Vaughn, I want to start with you. Does this action tell us anything about what we can expect from a second Biden term, or is this just election season maneuvering between President Biden and former President Trump to see who can become the biggest trade hawk between now and November 5th?
Thank you very much. Just up front, I know a lot of people probably know this already. I do represent steel producers, and I want to make clear that in all my answers today, I'm not wearing my steel. I'm talking on behalf of steel people. I'm also not talking on behalf of the anybody related to any of the campaigns. These are just my own opinions. I'm not cynical about what happened today, and I think that would be a mistake. I mean, I think that the administration has been looking at this process for a long time, and I know there's been a lot of conversations inside the administration over how they want to adjust those tariffs. Just to be clear, As I understand it, they're adjusting the tariffs under 301. So this won't affect the 232 tariffs or any of the 80 CVD tariffs that are already in place. I really think that what you're seeing over the last 5 or 6 years is there's a lot of consensus that the old trade policies don't work anymore, and that we need to be more sophisticated and more thoughtful in the way we approach these things. And I think you're going to see that on a number of these questions, that we're in a different era. So I think this is just a part of that. I think you're going to see both sides sort of trying to be, this isn't 2015 anymore. I think you're going to see both sides being very pragmatic when it comes to trade. Obviously, I think everybody understands how China is distorting steel markets around the world. And this strikes me as not a both reasonable and not that surprising move by the administration.
What's your take on this issue of Chinese overcapacity in particular, which is what the president's action is aimed at addressing? How differently would a second Biden term or a second Trump term be for tackling that specific issue?
So I think that
Sorry, Steve. That was for Greta.
Oh, sorry about that. Apologize.
But Greta, you're there. We go.
Thank you. And I'll adopt all of the caveats that Stephen said. My firm also represents steel companies. I'm also speaking on behalf of myself and not a campaign or any clients of my firm. And I would generally agree, right? The overcapacity problem is getting worse, not better. We see the steel coming from China and other locations far outstripping their own domestic demand and also world demand. And that's a threat, not just to the United States, but to our allies and partners around the world. I mean, I think that one of the biggest differences, both administrations see this as a serious problem, as a national security problem. But what's the answer? It is, yes, making sure we have the right defenses in place. But I think what you've seen from the Biden administration is much more outreach and attempt to really push those allies and partners to do more on this collective problem. It's a global marketplace. It is not just about the imports coming to the United States, but it is about how the industry and the marketplace is structured overall. And so I think you would continue to see that push from a second Biden administration on our allies and partners to continue to do more in the sectors and others where we see that critical overcapacity.
Kellyanne or Peter, any thoughts on this before we move on?
Sure, I'll just jump in quickly, again, with the same caveats as Greta and Stephen, being in private practice, representing purely my own views in this panel, and thanks to WITA for hosting. So overcapacity is going to be a challenge that any future president is going to have to deal with, not just in the steel industry, but other sectors. The problem is, and we saw this when I was in the Trump administration negotiating the G20, China doesn't want to negotiate any sort of stoppage or tools or any sort of outcome where they would produce less. They terminated the OECD process, which was designed to do that. So from the perspective of the United States, what are you going to do about it, right? We don't import enough Chinese steel to just target China and have that matter. So the Trump administration took on this approach of the 232s, where we're actually trying to put in place a measure that would address the global overcapacity, which is the distortion in markets. And I think the Biden administration is realizing that they need to do something similar. They've left the 232 tariffs in place. It's interesting that they did in this measure announce that they will be specifically targeting China. I think the impact of that will be relatively muted, just again, given the fact that we don't import that much steel from China in the first place. But I do think that this is a problem that the next administration is going to have to deal with. And whether you like tariffs or not, they seem to be one of the only tools that the US government has to try to get at some of these issues.
Okay, we'll move on to next bit of news. Report in Politico suggesting that the Trump term could see a move to devalue or revalue the U.S. dollar to try and lower the value of the dollar, make U.S. exports more attractive, make foreign products more expensive, and thus get at the trade deficit that way. I'm curious what each of you think of the likelihood of that happening, the likelihood of it succeeding, and what some of the complications or implications of such a move would be. Who would like to tackle that first? I'm going to choose somebody if nobody volunteers.
I can dive in first. I'm not a monetary policy expert by any stretch of the imagination, but of course, currency manipulation, currency practices from some of our trading partners, and the impact it has on the U.S. trade balance is something that folks in the trade space have been thinking about for a long time. I'm thinking particularly about China and its efforts to devalue its currency. The risks when you look at examining our own currency and devaluation, right, is risks of inflation, risks of weakening the dollar's status as that foreign, as the reserve currency. So I think you have to weigh between those objectives. Should we be going after currency manipulators? Should we be putting consequences on those countries that are devaluing their own currency in order to pursue their trade objectives? I think certainly that is something that the U.S. policymakers in any administration should be looking at. But I think when we're talking about our own currency, we really have to think about the spillover effects and what those implications could be. And so I think that's where the conversation should continue to go if this policy is being seriously considered.
Dave?
I would just say, obviously President Trump hasn't said, what he would do in this space. And so I think it would be, premature to really, guess as to what he's going to do. I will say, obviously, that one of the things that they did do in the last administration, Secretary Mnuchin did designate China as a currency manipulator. I think, currency manipulation is something that the last administration took fairly seriously. It is clearly a way of distorting markets in order to give an unfair advantage to certain, to change the terms of trade in behalf of the party that's doing the currency manipulation. And I think you'll see some sensitivities there. And obviously, I think that the President Trump has expressed his concern about the trade deficit generally. He recognizes that when you run a trade deficit, you are effectively selling off assets in order to cover your immediate consumption, and that can have significant long-term effects on our economy. So I think you're going to see them certainly look at various options, but I don't get the sense that any decision in that regard has been made yet.
Certainly there'd be, Peter?
I was just gonna say, I think that would be extremely hard, will prove extremely hard for any president, whether Biden reelected or whether Trump reelected, to succeed in kind of devaluing the dollar in a macro basis. As long as the U.S. has among the world's highest growth rates, as long as we have kind of an open capital account where foreigners can invest here, and as long as we have quite high, compared to many of our peers, interest rates, you're just going to see a ton of money wanting to come into the U.S. It's going to drive up keep the value of the dollar relatively high. And I think it's going to be, you look back sort of historically, it's quite hard to see a kind of systemic devaluation. Obviously, Reagan kind of managed some devaluation with the Plaza Accords in the 1980s. Maybe you could picture some sort of new diplomatically negotiated solution here, but it's very hard to see how you engineer a kind of unilateral devaluation without a lot of disruptive policy actions being taken, which is why I do think it makes more sense, as sort of both Greta and Steve have suggested, to focus really on the manipulation by a discrete set of our competitors and what they are doing to manipulate their currency to make their exports kind of unfairly attractive, and that's certainly where I'd hope next president will go, rather than thinking about kind of a systemic devaluation.
So certainly be a domestic political fight over doing any such thing. Wall Street would be certain to resist a deliberate move to push down the value of the dollar, I would think. One of the big questions I think about Trump term, if it were to materialize, is how much of President Biden's ambitious industrial policies, the CHIPS Act, the IRA, the infrastructure funding, how much of that would survive and continue in its current pace. I think there's been statements from Republicans to the effect that the IRA would be pretty much torn out, almost root and branch. Steve, are there parts of the Biden industrial policy initiatives that you think would survive?
Well, I think certainly one of the things that I think you'd see the Republicans do is they would certainly on taxing and spending and regulatory measures as a general matter. In the last administration, we were a low tax, low regulation, let the markets work, sort of administration that was very much in line with sort of traditional Republican Party practices. And I think if you look at the vote, for example, on the Inflation Reduction Act and on some of these other measures, they were not as popular, obviously, with the Republicans as they were with the Democrats. So I think we're more skeptical of the use of those type of practices. I don't think that necessarily means that we're against all of them or against them in every case. Obviously, Senator McConnell and some other members of the Senate did support those provisions, and my guess is that they would be analyzed sort of more on a country by country basis, but I mean a case by case basis. But I think as a general matter, the approach of the Republicans would be if we can get things more reciprocal in the trade space, if we can get the people more on a level playing field in terms of trade, if we can, push back against a lot of these unfair trading practices that we see around the world, then I think we would be more inclined to say domestically, let's let more of these things work out, in a market-based process as opposed to the government, necessarily funding so many of these things.
Kellyanne, a lot of this funding, or a fair bit of it anyway, is actually going into red or Republican states. Would that be reflected from the Budget Acts?
Yeah, I was going to add on as well. There's limits to what a president can do with respect to legislation, right? So when you're thinking about how an administration, a Trump 2, would approach the IRA or the CHIPS Act or DOE funding, I think you have to look at it through what are the tools that he would have to do something about it. And I look at the Treasury and IRS guidance on the IRA, for example, and the definition of foreign entity of concern. So while I don't necessarily see the political will right now to do a full repeal of the IRA unless Republicans sweep the House and Senate and we have the presidency, I do foresee a situation in which you would have a Trump administration looking to tighten some of those rules so that Chinese companies can't take advantage of some of the tax credits coming in. So that's one thing. I mean, the other thing to point out is that there is a distinction between the CHIPS Act and the IRA in terms of Republican support. So when it comes to semiconductors, you had a lot of Republicans voting for that bill who traditionally don't support industrial policy because of the national security angle. Whereas for the IRA, I think you have a lot of bitter Republicans who didn't want to see that bill passed and feel like they're stuck with it. So that's the difference. But I certainly would think that President Trump would want to address some of the China challenges.
Okay. I think it's fair to say one of the biggest questions that I hear, particularly from members of the business community, is whether a re-elected Joe Biden would take a different course on trade in second term than he's taken in the first term. From the business community that there is an active enough trade liberalization agenda, and still a lot of complaints and angst over the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which President Trump withdrew from his first days in office. if we see Joe Biden back for another 4 years, do you expect any change in emphasis? There's a line of argument I've heard that the president has spoken of sequencing, that the first term should be about investments in domestic production capacity, and on that, a second term might see initiatives of a different sort.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with that. I mean, look, I don't think, I think anyone in the business community who's still sitting around thinking that in term two, Joe Biden would, resurrect the TPP, just needs to, face the reality of that is not Joe Biden. I don't think there's really any meaningful chance of, kind of resurrecting a trade deal that he campaigned against and that he, has kind of continued to suggest he is not going to go back into. So I don't think we're going to see a kind of resurrection of, sort of mid 2010s era trade deal making if Joe Biden is reelected. That said, I do think the administration is beginning to think about, what a second term trade agenda, sort of international economic agenda might look like. I know most of the news this morning on the trade front has been about President Biden's announcement of a request to triple imports of tariffs on imports of Chinese steel, David, which you brought up at the beginning. But I'd also note yesterday that John Podesta, the White House climate advisor, gave a speech up at Columbia in which he announced the launch of a new White House-led climate and trade task force. And I think if you go and read that speech, you'll see they are clearly beginning to think about what a robust term two climate and trade agenda might look like. And that's something that I think we could possibly see Biden move forward on. Obviously, there have been these efforts over the last year or two to have a global arrangement on sustainable steel and on critical minerals agreements. But you can see in the Podesta speech, they are beginning to think, no, what would a major sort of energy and climate trade agenda in term two look like? I also think that they're, going to look at how they can build on the framework that they have put together with IPEF. Obviously, a lot of folks were disappointed but what happened with the trade pillar on IPEF a couple of months ago. And I don't know that would be kind of, fully resurrected in a term two. But I do think that the Biden administration will look on how it can build on some of the successes of IPEF on supply chain cooperation, some of these things that you can see getting underway to think through what would make sense in the region.
David, can I just make a comment here? And I generally agree with what Peter said. I think one thing about the business community is I think people do need to be a little bit more realistic about what's actually possible. I mean, in the last administration, we did trade deals with China and Japan and Korea and Canada and Mexico. And I can tell you, nobody wants to do trade deals with the United States. There was major political pushback on every one of those deals. The rest of the world is very, very happy with the global trading system. They're very happy running these big trade surpluses with the United States. They really are not in a hurry to change. And that's one of the reasons that, Ambassador Froman couldn't get the trade and investment partnership done with the EU. That's the reason the terms for the TPP were so bad that it never had a chance of getting through the Congress. Unless you have some way to get leverage on these other countries and convince them to come to the table, you're not going to get, any significant new trade deals, in my opinion.
Greta, I wanted to bring you in and expand on something Peter raised about IPEF and the collapse late last year of the trade pillar. Will the administration be any less allergic to trade in a second term if there's a second Biden term?
So I generally agree with what Peter said. I mean, I think it's going to be not a change of course on trade, but an evolution, right? Coming out of the investments we've made, coming out of the desire to push forward on climate, to look at these kind of bucket of things we call supply chain issues, which includes critical minerals. It includes trying to work with our partners on supply chains and pushing that conversation. So I do think that there's going to be an evolution to look outward, to look at how can we use trade to shore up these other objectives we have that are the investments we're making to counter oversupply, overcapacity, and to move forward on climate and to use trade tools in order to do that. And I think that those looking for ways to break out of the old model. And so I agree. I don't think we're going to go back to TPP, but I think there's going to be, looking at the announcement from Podesta, a lot of creative thinking about how can we use trade to support these other objectives we have to support the transformation of our economy and the worker-centric sort of policies and investments that we're making. And can we do that with our allies who should share our objectives, right? Who are facing many of the same challenges that we are, and are there opportunities there?
Kellyanne, just a quick question for you. Would you want to think that under a second Trump term, there would be no climate and trade agenda?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think the Trump administration, excuse me, was proud of a lot of the efforts that they made on environmental policy and climate policy. I think there's a difference in terms of theology with which Republicans embrace this concept of climate change versus Democrats, but that doesn't mean that anyone's allergic to the concept or the idea that we should be taking steps to protect our environment, frankly, raise environmental standards around us so that those who are producing with lower standards don't have an unfair advantage against US producers. Right. So that's kind of the nexus there. But there is some openness to creative thinking. Right. So I think the Biden administration is looking at, with the global steel arrangement, low carbon emission steel production with the European Union, like having conversations with allies who have similarly high production standards, whether that's environmental, labor, or others, and trying to come up with incentives and ways that we can more creatively link our supply chains, I think is an idea that is consistent both with the Trump and Biden teams. But I do think we'd approach it from slightly different angles.
Fair enough. Let's talk about the Biden administration recently pulled back on some expected work and drew great criticism from the business community on that score. What should the U.S. be doing on digital trade, and how differently would Biden and Trump pursue that particular area of trade policy? Greta?
Sure. So I think when you listen to USTR, Ambassador Tai yesterday at the Trade Agenda hearing and what they're saying on this, it's more nuanced than sort of just the top line of pulling back or rejecting. And it's an acknowledgement that there's a conversation going on domestically. It's pretty heated and fraught on all sides about our digital companies, our digital ecosystem, how we should be regulating or whether we should be regulating it, and that there's quite a bit of churn that is unresolved and should be reflected in our trade policy. I think a digital trade policy is one where the U.S. goes aggressively after protectionist policies that are hurting U.S. companies, that are unfair and are sort of legitimately trade policies. I think at the same time it does make sense to take a step back and say, okay, what in this environment that is changing so quickly, so rapidly, what does that mean, and what's coming up on the horizon? The digital trade policies have grown out of the sort of history that goes back, a couple decades now, and it's reasonable to say we need to reevaluate it and make sure that this makes sense for us, for consumers, for the American public generally. I mean, I think there's something in a Pew Research poll that over 80% of Americans don't trust companies with their data, and there's a lot of uncertainty out there. And I think that this reflects that a bit. And it's not to say we shouldn't have a digital trade policy and shouldn't go after protectionist policies and should be part of the conversation internationally. I think we have to be, right? But it is also, I think, reasonable to take a step back and say, well, is this narrowly tailored? Is this the right approach? How are we creating unintended consequences? And I think that that's really what USTR and what the administration is saying is they're inviting that conversation of saying, okay, if you want these policies, let's talk about that and talk about the concerns and come out with something that is representative of the United States as a whole.
Steve, how different would the Trump approach be on digital trade?
Yeah, so I mean, I think when we were looking at this, first of all, I agree with Greta. One of the problems that you've got, obviously, is that anytime there's divisions up on the Hill, and there are very significant divisions on the Hill with respect to this issue, that's going to make it more complicated for USTR to try to come up with a single policy, right? In other words, you have some people on the Hill who want to put a lot of digital rules in international agreements. There's some people on the Hill who really don't want to do that. And anytime you have that situation, it makes it, challenging for USTR. I do think that if you look back at the last administration, we were able to thread that needle, for example, on USMCA, and we were able to come up with a provision, that ultimately got through the Congress. I think also the last administration was more aggressive in terms of pushing back on some of these things like the threatened digital services tax, right? They launched a series of Section 301s and were prepared to be, I think, pretty aggressive in terms of pushing back against some of that protectionism that Greta was talking about. I think the biggest difference between the two administrations probably is that as a general matter, I think we were less optimistic than they are about the willingness of other countries to sort of sit down in good faith and try to work these things out. I think there is a very strong belief. We just saw this recently. Canada is still pushing ahead with their digital services tax. There's a very strong belief in the rest of the world that they want to restrain our tech industry. They want to make it harder for Americans to compete in these fields. Europe has this very strong idea of digital sovereignty, which is very important to them. And I think we see the whole playing field as more challenging in terms of potential roadblocks and difficulties in getting other countries to go where we want them to go.
Okay. Now, there have been reports that former President Trump is already thinking about a trade agenda if he's brought back to the White House. And some of the details that have leaked out include tariffs of perhaps up to 60% on Chinese imports, an across-the-board tariff on all imports of 10%. How seriously should we take these sort of campaign season leaks, and what would be the effect if those sort of policies were put in place?
So I'll go
Who would like-
first. Yeah, I'll say if you look at what he said in 2016, he talked about trade a lot, and when he got elected, he pretty much did what he said he was going to do. His actions in the administration were very consistent with his rhetoric in the campaign. He has talked about a 10% across the board tariff. He has talked about potentially going as high, like you said, to 60% potentially on some of these Chinese goods. So I think people should take all that very, very seriously. Personally, I think, he's right. I think that it is, the current path that we're on is very troubling in terms of, like I said before, we're not really able to get people to seriously engage with us on a lot of these issues. We are having to sell off very large, numbers of assets every year in order to cover the trade deficit. It distorts our economy, and that we become more and more of just a financial services sector type economy, as opposed to having a more balanced economy where you have more manufacturing and good manufacturing jobs. And I think if you go back and you look at what happened in 2018 and 2019, we did get a lot of people to the table. We did make a lot of deals, and we did see real median household incomes going up very, very rapidly. So I think that's the right policy. I think we should pursue that policy, and I think he will pursue that policy.
Peter or Greta from the other side of the
I mean, it's hard for me as a Democrat to speculate about what President Trump might do if he's reelected. Though I do agree with Stephen. I mean, having watched what President Trump campaigned on in 2015 and 2016, I agree with Stephen. He very much sort of implemented that agenda on trade once he was elected, and I think you have to. Expect he'd do the same. I will say, with respect to the very high tariffs on China, I think he'd obviously find quite a bit of bipartisan support for that. I'm not sure everybody would agree with 60%, but as we talked about at the beginning of this, Biden is looking at hiking tariffs on China on at least a number of products. We've also seen in the news the Biden administration is looking at increasing tariffs on automotive imports and things like that from China. So that sort of respect to the ultimate rate structure on China, I do think there's a broad bipartisan consensus out there that the U.S. Shouldn't be dependent on China for critical materials, that we probably have continue to have too large of a trade deficit with China, even as it's coming down. And so I do think you'd see bipartisan support for that. I think the 10% global tariff is something that would be a lot more controversial. Certainly many of our allies and partners would I think disagree with that quite strongly. I also think you'd see a lot of questions about whether, a 10% tariff on, pharmaceutical imports from Switzerland and Ireland and things like that is simply going to increase prices for seniors needing drugs, when at a time when incomes are already stretched. I think that was actually a 10% global tariff, I think would be quite a bit more controversial, and I think you'd see a lot of pushback over consumer price impacts and over what it does to alliances.
One of the signature accomplishments of the Trump administration was the replacement for NAFTA, the new USMCA agreement that's scheduled for a review in 2026. How differently would that review play out, and how different be the outcome under Biden versus Trump? Kellyanne?
Maybe I'll jump in. I'm half smiling because I worked as a negotiator for Trump, and I also worked as a career negotiator under the Obama administration. And I can tell you it was a lot more fun as a negotiator working under Trump than it was the administration before, in part because Trump does follow through with a lot of the threats, and he may not if a negotiation is reached ultimately. But I do think that under a Trump administration, you would see a lot more pressure on both Canada and Mexico to make changes to that agreement in areas that aren't working. I think that negotiation would be a lot more dynamic. Now, that may be more stressful for the business community who's watching right now in terms of potential outcomes, but I do think it would be a more robust negotiation. Under either scenario, though, we're really going to have to address the threat of Chinese goods, and particularly in the automotive sector, coming in through Mexico to the United States. And the current USMCA rules don't seem to be able to prevent that from happening. And so there's going to be pressure on either administration to do something there and to fix a number of other issues that may be on the table. But the last thing I'll say, because I get a lot of questions about this from companies who are nervous about this renegotiation and what it means for the agreement, but it's also an opportunity, right? There may be new issues where the three economies can work together to try to push the rules even further and further integrate our economies where it makes sense. But the difference between the both, I think the Trump negotiation would be much more dynamic.
And what areas other than autos do you think negotiators will get something that isn't working as we expected, or here's something that we think should be tweaked or tightened?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in because this was kind of more our idea. I think it's very important to understand this is something that the Trump administration really wanted, right? You were there, you covered those negotiations. This was a new provision to have the agreement come up for review. It was something that we pushed hard for. We think it's a great idea. And I think, I agree with Kellyanne. I think it would be a very robust negotiation. I don't think it would just be limited to a few issues. I think we would want to really sit and talk about how do we improve this agreement. There were, a number of items that were still left on the table the last time. I think you'd want to really tighten those supply chain issues that Kellyanne talked about. You think you'd want to really think about how the three economies interact with each other on China. I think some of these digital issues we're talking about, I'm sure they would be we'd be looking for potential upgrades there. I think we'd be looking, at the rapid response mechanism and how that's working and what are the type of cases that have been brought there. And then as Kellyanne and Greta and everybody knows who spent a lot of time up on the Hill, there are always requests in the agriculture space. Mexico has been really putting up some troubling issues on the ag side. And of course, we have our usual disputes with Canada on ag. So I think it would be, I agree with Kellyanne. I think it would be a very robust debate. And I think it would really show people that we're better off having these things as living documents, that we talk about it, we keep them up to date, as opposed to just kind of letting them sit there for years and drift.
Greta, would the review, do you think, be as robust or as searching under Biden as under Trump?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, there was a lot of skepticism about this mechanism when it was originally proposed, but this administration has embraced USMCA and this mechanism in particular. And I can say that all of the issues that have been raised, autos coming in from Mexico, also I think steel was mentioned as a part of the announcement of the increase of tariffs on China, a note of that concern of steel coming through Mexico and possibly through Canada too, right? These are our two biggest import locations for steel. And so that trade with China and its impact on those markets, really important for the United States. Autos, of course, the market has changed so much since the rules were negotiated. And are those rules working now? I think that there's a lot of questions. And then also, of course, the potential Chinese investments in Mexico in the auto sector. I think dairy certainly is a sector that the Biden administration would be looking at, and whether Canada has really lived up to the bargain that the United States struck there. As Stephen mentioned, there are things that, I think this administration would certainly say were left on the table when the Trump administration negotiated. So I think it would be a robust negotiation. I think that there's a lot of tough issues that the market needs to work out collectively. And I think it's useful. I think that having a mechanism like this helps to prevent our trade agreements from becoming irrelevant or outdated, not fit for purpose. We see the world changing rapidly in a lot of different sectors, and having a way to adapt so that we can continue to use them to both resolve our disputes and also set the rules for how we're going to trade with ourselves and how we're going to be a strong market in this global situation we have right now. So I think that, under a second Biden administration, there would be a long list, a lot of consultation with Congress, with stakeholders, and a really robust negotiation.
Great. Now, before Ken returns momentarily for audience questions, I do want to talk about supply chain resilience. And Peter, you've probably been changing on this topic given your work in the White House. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of action on trying to promote more resilient supply chains in the wake of our pandemic era experience. What sort of concrete steps in this regard could we expect in a second Biden term, and how might Donald Trump approach that issue? Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, so obviously you've seen supply chain resilience be a major focus of the Biden administration. I think you saw the Trump administration focus on it as well. Obviously, particularly towards the end of the Trump administration with the pandemic, Trump was looking to figure out how to manufacture PPE and vaccines and things here in the U.S. And I think we often forget that the CHIPS Act, although Biden got funding for the CHIPS Act across the finish line, it was actually the Trump administration that got Congress to pass the first kind of legislative framework for the CHIPS Act. So I think you actually see a fair amount of bipartisan agreement on the need for greater supply chain resilience. Doesn't mean kind of agreement on every product or every tool there, but I think you see a lot of agreement on the need for supply chain resilience in a range of critical products. I think you'll see, what have you seen the Biden administration do over the last couple of years? You've seen a focus on domestic investment. You've begun to see, and something I think will carry forward into a term two, a focus on, as other countries, especially allied countries, are making their investments, how do we coordinate and deconflict those investments? I take CHIPS Act, for example. We have CHIPS Act here. Europe, Japan are also doing CHIPS Act. And I think you see the administration trying to figure out how to make sure semiconductor companies can't just play the U.S. and its allies off against each other in a subsidies race. And I think you'll see more of a focus in a term two on kind of coordinated investments. I think you see with IPEF, and I think you'll see more of a focus on this of how do you really build out mechanisms for kind of tactical coordination on supply chain disruptions. How do you monitor for disruptions that are coming, kind of up the line, and tactically work on how making sure those disruptions don't materialize. And then I think it'll be interesting to see, in part of a term, as part of a term two, of would there be some actual, potentially with some binding rules, supply chain resilience, type agreements that the administration might try to negotiate. You see that some with the critical minerals space with Japan, and ongoing negotiations have stalled with the Europeans. But how might you build on that architecture to kind of do some actual agreements on supply chain resilience?
Anyone else have supply chain thoughts, or should we move on to questions? Hearing no objection, I guess we'll move on to questions. If we had a question from Bill Lane, if inflation starts to surge again, do you think freer trade as an unused tool to fight inflation, or will the view be that a steel-centric trade policy remains the ticket to re-election?
Just jump in on that.
Steve?
Like, I want to challenge the premise on some of this question. I think, look, early in the sort of 21, 22, as inflation heated up, obviously, there were a lot of views expressed, particularly by members of the business community, that the China tariffs and things like that were really major drivers of inflation. I don't really think the economic evidence bore that out. I think the reality is that the kind of tariffs on China and measures like that had at most a kind of de minimis impact on inflation, and I just never saw them. I don't think you saw the administration ever see them as a major driver of inflation. It was being driven by supply chain disruptions. It was being driven by monetary policy, by some of these kind of things. It was not being driven by trade policy. And so I want to kind of challenge the premise of the question, because I don't really think that the inflationary impacts one way or the other of the China tariffs have been a particularly big policy consideration here.
I just want to say, so go ahead, Kellyanne.
Oh, sure. We may be making the same point, Stephen. If I can just add to that too, it might be the wrong audience for that question in some ways, because I think what has become apparent through this conversation is there are certainly differences between Trump and Biden's trade policies, but there's also a fair amount of consistency in the goal of really addressing the middle class and creating something that's durable, right? That has more bipartisan support, that doesn't just cater to some of the policies of the last several decades. That we as a country are moving in a slightly different direction than I think the premise of that question is suggesting, right? So that's not an option under either a Trump or Biden scenario. So in terms of like the inflationary impacts of tariffs, I think both administrations are comfortable with tariffs. I think that's pretty clear from the last 4 years of the Biden administration. The Trump administration is going to take a bigger swing, right? So I think you'll see higher fluctuations in terms of the tariff rates and perhaps a broader set of uses for tariffs. But the same sort of underlying philosophy that tariffs can help achieve certain objectives is the same in both administrations. I think instead you'll see what Peter talked about before, which is trying to address some of the supply chain issues, trying to create a domestic economy where companies want to come and invest, taking care of some of those other more macro issues as a way to alleviate inflation, as opposed to looking at tariffs as either driving them or alleviating the pressure. Stephen, what did I miss?
I don't have anything to say. I agree with Peter and Kellyanne.
Well, there's the news of the day right there.
Absolutely. You know, there's been some questions. We've had some interesting questions come in that gets into some of the nuance that have been going on in the conversation. And we've heard a little bit of a sort of a more aggressive posture being postulated about a potential Trump agenda on negotiating trade agreements than we've heard on sort of what we might see on the Biden side. And I guess that's sort of the crux of the question. And there's sort of two of them that are asking it. You know, would we see, we haven't seen a lot of concrete trade negotiations during the Biden term so far. Might we see those? And what is the appetite on the Hill for supporting trade agreements going forward? Obviously, the Trump administration had quite a lot of success with USMCA, working with a lot of Democrats in Congress to get that passed. You know, is there a proactive negotiating agenda on opening markets for American companies doing business overseas?
Well, I'll start for the look. You know, I think everybody who remembers this remembers that for us, these two things were tied together, right? In other words, we felt that we wanted to be aggressive and take some of these big swings, like Kellyanne said. At the same time, we were also very aggressive in terms of negotiating. So in 2018, 2019, we were negotiating with sort of all these different countries at the same time. I would anticipate that you'd see something similar to that. We do not think the two agendas are in conflict. In fact, I think that if you don't have a fairly robust trade agenda in terms of what you're trying to do here at home, it's going to be very difficult to get other countries to come to the table and seriously engage with you. So I think on our end, if the Trump administration were to come back in, I think you'd see a robust enforcement agenda and a robust negotiating agenda.
So speaking of negotiation, there are two topics we really haven't addressed. They're both come up in the questions. Actually, our friend Jean-Francois Boitin asks two different questions that I want to put out there with two different topics, but I think we can tie them together. Future of trade, US-EU trade. Obviously, there's the TTC under President Biden. What might we see on US-EU trade relations? And then really the elephant in the room, and this is not a Republican elephant, but the WTO. I haven't really talked about that yet either. You know, are some threats of pulling out of the WTO on day one or day three realistic, or are there some reform proposals that are out there that could see us revigorating the WTO going forward? Throwing that out to all of you. I don't know who wants to jump in first. Europe and the WTO.
I'll jump in on both of those. First, let me say on Europe, I think, you know, getting a trade deal with Europe would be extremely hard, not just on our side, but as Stephen said in some earlier remarks, on the European side. I mean, part of the reason the Biden administration did the TTC with Europe is that the Europeans very much proposed it during the transition, and they wanted it in lieu of trade agreement negotiations. They didn't really want to have a trade negotiation with the U.S. that would force them to make, hard choices on things like agriculture and, some of the things they've long protected. So I think what you're going to see is under a Biden term two is not really going to be deal making with Europe. But, what we have seen over the last, couple of years of trying to find practical areas of cooperation, whether it is AI regulation or whether it's some of the supply chain disruptions and things like that. You know, on the WTO, look, I'm a pessimist on the future of the WTO. I mean, this is an organization that, you know, was stood up and has tariff rates from the 1990s. You know, as Stephen and Kellyanne and Greta all said earlier, you know, one of the advantages of USMCA is it has a review mechanism, so you can actually force some changes. You know, the WTO doesn't have a review mechanism, so, and it's consensus based. So it's very hard to see how you force changes in rules through the WTO, and you know, they are. Whether it's tariff rates or some of the rules, you know, they're rules that are 30 some odd years old now. And I think, you know, hard to see the U.S. Continuing to support them. Also hard to see it change. So I'm kind of pessimistic. I mean, if you look at what's happened practically over the last some years, you've seen the increasing kind of use of the U.S. just settling disputes outside the WTO. You know, Trump and China essentially came to a trade deal just outside the WTO. If you look at the disagreements the Europeans had with the IRA under the Biden administration, we basically just struck a deal outside the WTO rather than litigating it through the WTO. And I think you're going to see, you know, maybe middle powers continue to want to, you know, focus on the WTO to, you know, negotiate, you know, trade arrangements between themselves. You know, you need something that kind of governs South African, you know, Malaysian trade, and that is kind of a universal standard. But I think, you know, for the U.S. and some of the other major trade powers, you're more likely to just see this kind of continuing, you know, negotiations outside the WTO over trade issues.
Kellyanne?
Sure. Just, well, on the EU, and maybe we're all sort of washed up former U.S. negotiators. My sense is the EU doesn't want a trade deal with us. So I think we're going to have more of the same, which is just ongoing talks over issues and arguing over who's subsidizing more. But interest to have a strong, functioning, multilateral trading system that prevents our workers, our farmers, our producers from being discriminated against by other countries who cut each other better deals than they cut us. The problem is the current system isn't functioning. We haven't had real negotiations in 20 years. We have, as Peter said, tariff rates that are frozen in time. There doesn't seem to be a way to drive the system forward. And so what you have is this proliferation of FTAs from other countries. The US is currently sitting out, which is the frustration, and I think in one of the questions you raised, Ken, of like, where's our offensive trade agenda? But we can either keep negotiating these deals, or we can go and actually fix the problem, which is the WTO, or create something like it. I just don't see a lot of interest in our trading partners in doing that. And I've had conversations with a number of countries about this who just kind of look at it and say, well, it's not that broken. We don't need to fix it. The problem is in the US, it is that broken. And so until other countries get on board with wanting to negotiate with us, I just don't know where it goes.
Yeah, I would agree with pretty much everything Peter and Kellyanne said. I think in terms, I'll just say two quick things. I think the Europeans have to decide, do they really ever want to negotiate with the United States on any of these issues, or do they believe that the world is just so filled with rules and laws that negotiation isn't really possible anymore? So I think that's a decision they've got to make. I think in terms of the WTO, I mean, let's be clear, if you brought back the appellate body, almost everything we've been talking about, everything the Biden administration has done, everything the Trump administration has done, the AB would just strike it all down, like on day one or day 60, or as soon as they could get to it, right? So I just don't think any administration is going to seriously engage and give the WTO that type of leverage over U.S. trade policy ever again.
Greta, I think you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with many of the points that have been made. I think, you know, with the EU, we should always be looking for those opportunities where we have shared interests. You know, I think that taking action collectively or coordinated with respect to China over capacity, working with them on some of these common problems, trade and climate, but we have to have a continuing dialogue with them. Sometimes I feel like the EU and the US, we're like siblings. In some ways, we're so alike, but it magnifies those differences, right? And it's, you know, why focus on those differences when we could be cooperating on our shared challenges? On the WTO, Yes, the U.S. comes from, a very different perspective from many of its trading partners. And so, it's easy to have that very pessimistic view of it. But at the same time, we have to be there. We have to be present. We have to be active. We have to be calling out countries who are breaking the rules and not playing on a fair playing field. And we have to push for reform. And it may be a very long conversation, but it's necessary. And we have to be an active part of it. We have to put our money where our mouth is and try to get those changes we want to see, even if it feels like we're, hitting our heads against a brick wall, which whether you're at the WTO or talking to the EU, sometimes if you're a US negotiator, that is exactly what it feels like. But it's important. It's an important forum. It's important for us to be there and to be a leader.
This is great. This is really, really helpful to hear all of your perspectives on this topic. That's really, I know not for the outside of the trade community, people aren't talking about the WTO on a daily basis, but certainly our friends are. And, we've been talking, I was checking out some dates. The Uruguay round started in 1986. So, and that was when we basically refashioned the entire GATT system into the WTO system. It took 8 years, basically, of negotiations. So, around the 40th anniversary of the formation of the GATT was when we started that round. We're at the we're just at the 30th anniversary of the WTO. So maybe that is something to start thinking about. What is that? Is there some sort of large global initiative that maybe takes quite a while to do, but that is that next successor organization for the WTO or whatever that might look like. Any final thoughts before we wrap up? Because we've gone a little bit over already. David, any thoughts?
No, I didn't get the poll of the panelists on who they expect to be the next trade representative. So if anybody wants to venture a name, there's still time. Otherwise, I'll leave it to you to wrap up.
Or are they any of the people that are on this session right now?
I wasn't going to point that out.
Anyway, well, thank you all, or people who might be watching, and who are in our audience. Anyway, thanks all of you for joining us today. Really, really appreciate it. Look forward to having all of you back on again, future WITA sessions. And I know we have actually Peter and Stephen on our China seminar that's coming up next month. So thanks to all of you for joining us. Really grateful. Everyone, please take care, and we'll see you soon.